You're locked in darkness beneath the greatest arena ever built. Above you, the vibrations have stopped 50,000 voices that once roared for blood, now silent, fading into the Roman night. Your husband died hours ago. You watched through the iron grate as they dragged what remained of him across the sand. Now there's only the drip of water somewhere in the blackness, the distant growl of caged animals, and your own breathing. Then you hear it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Getting closer, a torch appears at the end of the corridor, casting shadows that dance like demons on stone walls, carved with names you'll never read. The man holding it is still covered in the afternoon's work sand, stuck to blood that isn't his. Bronze armor dented where someone tried and failed to kill him. A guard appears behind him, keys jangling. The gladiator's eyes sweep across the row of cells. Then they stop. On yours. The key turns in the lock. Before we descend further into what happened in these chambers, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from? It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, this deliberately erased from our textbooks, can reach people across every continent who are hungry for the truth history tried to bury. Because what I'm about to show you isn't speculation or Hollywood drama. This is documented, written down by Romans themselves with the casual indifference of men describing weather patterns. The evidence is carved into the walls beneath the Colosseum, recorded in ledgers stored in Vatican archives, mentioned in poetry and satire by writers who saw nothing unusual about any of it. This was Tuesday in the Roman Empire. And the most disturbing part isn't what happened. It's how normal they considered it to be. Let's talk about what Rome actually did with its power when the spectacle ended and the public went home. The year is 86 AD. Emperor Domitian has just sponsored games lasting 100 days to celebrate his military victories in Germania. The Colosseum, completed just 6 years earlier, is the crown jewel of Roman engineering, a monument to empire that can be flooded for naval battles, can elevate exotic animals from underground on mechanical lifts, can orchestrate the deaths of thousands with theatrical precision. But the building everyone sees, the architectural marvel that still stands today, is only half the structure. Beneath the arena floor lies the hypogeum, vast underground network of tunnels, chambers, animal cages, and something else. Rooms that served a purpose Roman tour guides today don't like to discuss. When Rome conquered a territory that had dared to resist, a Germanic tribe that ambushed a legion, or a Britannic settlement that refused. Tribute. The aftermath followed military protocol refined over centuries. This wasn't random brutality. This was systematic processing of human resources with the same bureaucratic efficiency Rome applied to building roads and collecting taxes. Men of fighting age were separated first. Those who had actively fought were executed immediately, their heads sometimes sent back to their villages as warnings. Those who survived were marked for hard labor in mines, where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Children under a certain age were valuable commodities, sent to slave markets in the East, where distance made rebellion impossible and childhood trauma made them easier to control. Women of childbearing age were classified differently. Captivity, war prizes belonging to the state. They weren't criminals being punished. They were inventory being catalogued. Officials called commentarii maintained ledgers with the same detail they used for tracking grain shipments. Each woman received a number, an origin designation, Germanica, Britannica. Parthicand, a category that determined her value and use. Some would be sold to patrician households as domestic slaves. Others would be sent to brothels, licensed and taxed by the state. And some, those from tribes that had particularly offended Rome, would be sent to the arenas. Not to fight. It's not even to be executed publicly, which at least carried a certain terrible drama. No, they were sent to be stored, to wait, to become part of a reward system that solved several problems for Rome simultaneously. The empire had a security challenge it could never fully resolve. How to control incredibly dangerous, incredibly valuable men who had every reason to hate their captors and the combat skills to do something about it. Gladiators existed in a paradox that defined their entire existence. They were slaves with less legal status than dogs, property that could be bought, sold, and killed at their owner's discretion. But they were also celebrities whose names were scratched into walls by admirers, whose faces appeared on oil lamps and mosaics, whose sweat literally was bottled and sold as aphrodisiacs to wealthy Roman women. Graffiti from Pompeii still preserves these testimonials. Celadus, the Thracian, makes the girls sigh. Crescens, the net fighter. Dr. Two nighttime girls. Noble women paid fortunes to bribe guards for private encounters with famous gladiators, causing scandals that rippled through patrician families. But underneath the celebrity worship lived a terror that never left Roman consciousness. In 73 BC, 78 gladiators escaped from a training school in Capua. They were led by Spartacus, a Thracian who'd served in the Roman auxiliary forces before being enslaved. Within months, they commanded an army of 70,000 escaped slaves and defeated multiple Roman legions. For 2 years, these men, who were supposed to be controlled entertainment for the masses, nearly brought the Republic to its knees. When Rome finally crushed the rebellion, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, one body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers. A forest of crosses visible for days of travel. That image was burned into Roman cultural memory forever. So how do you control men who know how to kill, who have legitimate grievances, who the public simultaneously worships, and who you legally classify as subhuman? You need a system of calculated rewards that feels significant to them but costs you nothing. Extra rations, prize money for exceptional performances. And after particularly impressive victories, especially during imperial games where the emperor himself was watching. Gladiators were granted what ancient sources call privileges of the victor. The phrase appears in fragments across multiple writers' martials' epigrams, juveniles, satires, administrative records from arena management. Roman authors mention it with the casual brevity of people referencing something too obvious to explain. But when you cross-reference these fragments with what we know about Roman military culture, the architecture beneath the arenas, and basic logic about how the system functioned, a picture emerges that modern historians have had to create new terminology to describe: Victoria Carnalis, the carnal victory. Romans never called it that because to them it didn't need a special name. It was just how things worked. After an afternoon where he'd killed 3 opponents and survived a lion attack. After the crowd had chanted his name until their voices went hoarse. After the emperor had granted him a laurel wreath from the imperial box, a gladiator would be escorted down into the hypogeum, still wearing his armor, still covered in blood and sand. An official from the Ludisa gladiatorial school that owned him, or sometimes an arena administrator, would accompany him. They'd walk through tunnels lit by oil lamps, past the mechanical elevators that lifted animals to their deaths, past the arms storage, until they reached a specific section of holding cells far from the public access areas. Archaeological excavations beneath the Colosseum and other amphitheaters across the Empire Capua, Pompeii, and Chiem's have revealed chambers that don't fit any obvious logistical purpose. They're small, 10 to 15 square meters. They're located in isolated sections away from animal cages and gladiator preparation rooms. Their architecture includes features that make modern archaeologists profoundly uncomfortable. Stone benches built at specific heights, iron rings anchored into walls at floor level, at waist height, at shoulder height. Heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron that lock only from the outside. And in several chambers, the walls show evidence of desperate scratching human fingernails trying to claw through solid stone. The women held in these cells had already endured a journey through circles of hell most people couldn't imagine surviving. They'd watched their villages burn. They'd had their children torn from their arms, screaming names they'd never hear again. They'd been chained to dozens of other women and marched hundreds of miles to Rome. Whipped when they stumbled, watching companions die from exhaustion, and being left in ditches. They'd been stripped, examined like livestock by officials checking for disease or pregnancy, assigned a number, and locked underground in the greatest monument to the civilization that had destroyed everything they knew. The waiting was its own torture. Sound carried in the hypogeum. They could hear everything. The roar of 50,000 voices above when someone they might have known was torn apart by animals. The metallic clang of swords. The theatrical music during the midday executions when condemned prisoners were forced to reenact myth sect. The deaths were real. The poet Martial describes these fatal charades with disturbing casualness. A prisoner, dressed as Orpheus, torn apart by a bear that did not listen to his songs. A woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasipio, which meant being assaulted by a bull in front of thousands of spectators until she died from her injuries. Whatever myth tells us, Martial writes almost proudly, the arena makes real. This was the soundscape these women lived in, and they knew with absolute certainty they would never leave. There was no ransom system, no prisoner exchange. Rome didn't negotiate with the conquered. Their people back home, if any survived, would never know what happened to them. They'd simply vanished into the machinery of empire. Under Roman law, they weren't legally human anymore. They were classified as race things, property the same legal category as furniture or livestock. You couldn't commit a crime against a chair. And even suicide, one of the few escapes Roman culture sometimes viewed with philosophical respect, was denied to them because if they somehow managed it, they'd be depriving the state of its property. Then came the footsteps, the door opening, the gladiators standing in the entrance, silhouetted by torchlight, still radiating the adrenaline of survival and the particular electricity of a man who'd just been worshipped by thousands. The guard would unlock the designated cell, a key. Some accounts suggest the gladiator could choose. Others imply women were simply assigned like equipment being checked out of a warehouse. Either way, a door would close and lock from the outside. What happened next isn't described in explicit detail in surviving texts. Roman writers mention the practice, but not the mechanics. The same way modern corporate documents might reference employee incentive programs without detailing what those incentives are. But the architecture tells the story that texts won't. Those iron rings, those benches at specific heights, those doors that lock from outside, the scratch marks from fingernails that wore away stone but never achieved escape. This wasn't hidden criminal behavior. This was infrastructure. This was part of the operational budget of the games, managed by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena equipment. From the state's perspective, the system was elegantly efficient. It rewarded loyal gladiators at essentially zero-cost. Captive women were classified as spoils of war, already absorbed into state property. It reinforced the gladiator's sense of power and status without actually granting him real freedom or authority. He could experience dominance over the conquered, the same privilege the emperor enjoyed while still being property himself. And it sent a message to conquered populations across the empire. This is what Roman power means. This is what happens when you resist, not just to your warriors, but to your daughters and wives. A Roman writer whose name is lost to history, but whose work survives in later quotations, put it with disturbing clarity. The victor claims his prize in the manner the empire claims its provinces by right of conquest. The parallel was intentional. The gladiator reenacting imperial prerogative was part of the theater. The whole system was propaganda, even the parts that happened in darkness. But occasionally, the system broke in unexpected ways. For all its industrialized cruelty, Rome was obsessed with maintaining certain fictions about itself. The empire saw itself as bringing civilization, law, and order to a barbarian world. This self-image required that some horrors remain hidden, their existence undeniable, but their visibility controlled. Which brings us to an event that forced uncomfortable visibility. Female gladiators, gladiatress, gladiatessas appeared occasionally in the arena. Ancient sources are conflicted about who these women were. Some were clearly slaves, forced to fight for spectacle. But others appear to have been noble women who, in a culture that gave women almost no agency, saw the arena as a perverse form of power and celebrity. The very existence of female fighters scandalized Rome's elite. The satirist Juvenal wrote with dripping contempt about aristocratic women who trained with gladiatorial weapons. What sense of shame can be found in a woman who wears a helmet? In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus attended games in Antioch that featured female combatants. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was present, something unexpected happened. The Greek portion of the audience reacted with the same solemnity they'd show male gladiators watching in respectful silence, acknowledging skill and courage. But the Roman spectators turned the entire event into obscene theater, shouting sexual comments, jeering, treating the women not as warriors, but as a pornographic sideshow accidentally placed in a venue meant for death combat. Severus was reportedly mortified. Not by the violence female captives were still held in chambers beneath that very arena. Not by any concern for the women's dignity. He was mortified because the dignity of the games themselves, his propaganda tool, is being undermined by the audience's inability to separate violence from sex when women were involved. The facade was cracking, so he banned women from fighting in the arena entirely. The problem wasn't protecting women from violence. The problem was that the violence had become too visible in a way that made Rome's self-image uncomfortable. The emperor was fine with the abuse. He just wanted it to happen in the shadows where it had always primarily operated. And it did, for centuries more. Here's what should truly disturb you about this story. This system didn't end because of moral evolution or ethical awakening. The gladiatorial games continued for another 2 centuries, even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century. Christian emperors still sponsored the games. Christian senators still attended. The cognitive dissonance was resolved not by ending the practice, but by not thinking about it too carefully. The last recorded gladiatorial combat happened in 404 AD, when a monk named Hughes jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was torn apart by an outraged crowd. Only then did Emperor Honorius permanently ban gladiatorial combat. But even that didn't end the system of captivity. The infrastructure remained. The practice of taking war captives remained standard military procedure throughout the Byzantine period. The chambers beneath the arenas stayed operational for other purposes. The institution eventually faded not because humanity progressed morally, but because the Roman Empire itself collapsed. The machinery of conquest stopped, so the supply of captives dried up. The system died from lack of resources, not from ethical evolution. Today, when tourists visit the Colosseum, they take selfies in front of magnificent arches and marvel at ancient engineering that could flood an arena for naval battles. Tour guides talk about gladiatorial courage and the ingenuity of mechanical animal lifts. Most never mention what happened in the chambers below, but those chambers are still there. Those iron rings bolted into walls haven't rusted away. The scratch marks from desperate fingernails are preserved beneath centuries of dust. The ledgers that recorded human beings as numbered property are stored in archives accessible to anyone who wants to read them. In one chamber beneath the amphitheater in Capuitha, same city where Spartacus launched his rebellion, archaeologists found graffiti scratched into stone by hands that had nothing left but the need to testify. Most are fragmentary, but a few are legible. One written in crude Latin by someone clearly not a native speaker translates roughly to, "I was Amelia of the Belgi. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another, in what appears to be Celtic, has been translated as, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." These aren't the voices history typically preserves. Roman chronicles name emperors and generals, track military victories and architectural achievements, record the names of gladiators whose fame lasted centuries. They don't record the names of conquered women cataloged as property. But the stones remember. The Colosseum stands as a monument to what empire actually means. Not just the grand architecture and military victories we celebrate in history books, but the industrialized horror required to maintain absolute power. Every stone in that arena was bought with more than money and slave labor. It was bought with lives destroyed in the most systematic ways humans have ever devised. The spectacle on the sand, the part historians teach and filmmakers romanticize, was only the half of it that Rome wanted you to see. The other half happened in those chambers beneath your feet. In the moments after the crowd's roar faded into silence, in darkness lit only by a single torch. Those voices that weren't supposed to be preserved, the ones Roman chroniclers didn't think worth recording, are still there in those walls. Aemilia of the Belgi, the woman who prayed to any god who might listen, the thousands whose names we'll never know. They're still waiting, in a sense, for someone to bear witness, for someone to say, this happened. This was real. This was normal. And now you can never look at those stones the same way again.